So just to review, the instinctual subtype is the primal area in which we act out our dominant Enneagram type. So, and I'm going to keep reiterating this sort of primal aspect because it's really important into understanding the instinctual subtype because it's almost more unconscious and more automatic than the actual Enneagram type itself. There are three instincts: the social, self-preservation, and sexual or intimate instinct, or one-to-one sometimes as it's called. For some, the instinct is more primary than the actual Enneagram style, and so we're going to emphasize that too, because as we go through, sometimes it's easier to recognize the instinct over the actual Enneagram type, and so that's going to be important to note as well. We utilize all three of the instinctual centers, but one, of course, is dominant, like I mentioned before. And instincts are represented in a stacking, so we can refer to instincts like a three-layered cake. Often is what we like to talk about it. So you'll have your first layer, which will be your primary instinct, then your middle layer, and then your bottom layer. And they can be different sizes. So you can have a really huge first instinct, and then a smaller middle instinct, and then a really big bottom instinct or a smaller instinct. But one is primary, and then one is, the rest of them will kind of trickle down. Identifying social subtypes, you want to look for, there are a few things that you can always kind of look for to help you distinguish who's social and who isn't. Social subtypes frequently utilize the interview overview style of conversation. So that just means that when they meet someone, or even when they reunite with an old friend, they want to find out, the interview overview. So how have you been? What's been going on? And we all do that in social situations. But the social subtype enjoys it. And so they like to kind of figure out, okay, generally what's been going on, give me an overview of what's been going on, and then they may circle back to talk about something deeper later, but they enjoy that at first, and they talk about that being an important part of their conversational process because they just like to know generally what's going on with people. So they'll walk around if there's more than one person somewhere that they know, and they'll get that kind of interview overview. What's been going on? How have you been? How are your kids? How's work? They want to know generally what's been going on with everything. They may enjoy small talk or chit chats. A lot of social subtypes say they enjoy it. 4s and 5s generally don't like it, no matter if they're social or self-pres or sexual. It doesn't matter. But in general, they may like that sort of easy, kind of breezy talking where they just sit down and chit chat about whatever it is. It's a very social way to interact. There's frequent attention to group happenings. So political stories, or what's going on in politics, or organizational buzz, this is happening in this business, or did you hear about this in this department, or celebrity news, and or work relationships, or just in general group relationships. What is this group doing with this group, or what are these people in this group talking about, or whatever it is, they are paying attention, they're tracking that. And so there's a lot of attention. Politics is one that is most obvious, but if you're in an organization and you're social in an organization, then you're going to pay attention to who's friends with who knows who has the power in the relationships. They like to know sort of what the hierarchy is, the pecking order. That's important. They may know information about various members of the group as a form of security. So this is very important because when we think of knowing information about different members of the group, sometimes you can think of 2s, and they exacerbate that a lot. Like social 2s, for example, will know gossip about a lot of people. And that's a way that they have power in the group. But all social subtypes will do this as it's a form of leverage. It's sort of like if you know what other people are doing, then you know where you stand, and you can know how to leverage that information if you need to later. They'll pay attention to hierarchical relationships, like I mentioned earlier. So who's in charge, who has the power, who's more popular, why are they more popular? Is there a way that I can be more popular or form my own group that can oppose this popularity? That kind of thing. They can seem one-ish. All social subtypes can seem a little one-ish because of a focus on rules, norms, and acceptability, so they want to be appropriate. So even if they're not ones, sometimes they'll talk about appropriateness, being acceptable, what are the rules, what is everybody else doing. So even when they're not, even when they're 8s, they're still going to be focusing on what are other people doing, because it's the focus on the group, and they need to not stick out too much because it's important. Now, you can get the antisocial variant that is really obviously trying to buck the social norm. So even when it's like Erin was talking about, when it's that obvious, and they're just really obviously trying to break social norms and trying to go against like Marilyn Manson is a great example. You're dealing with probably somebody who's social, because if you're trying that hard to subvert the norm, you're still tracking the group. Like, it's still important to you.
Yeah, and Alexandra actually asked an interesting question that I want to be more specific about. She was asking if you can have positive and negative with each one, and definitely you can. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to have 100% a positive experience or negative experience, unless you've just been so lucky that you haven't had any wounding in any of the areas, which is virtually impossible if you're human. But particularly, yeah, sixes are probably going to vacillate back and forth in a way that other types may not be prone to doing. But I do think it's really important to point out that you can change your association. So while you may not be able to change your subtype, you may have always been self-pressed throughout your life. If you've had a negative relationship to that, that's something you can work on and you can change.
Right.
So, you know, we can't change our type, we can't change our subtype, but we can change our relationship to them and how we deal with these arenas in life. So that's kind of the good news.
The self-conception will obviously focus on around the Enneagram type, but then also the instinct. So the social subtype is always thinking, who am I in relation to the group? Who am I in relation to these people? So, you know, even if you're, you know, in the emo scene, you need to know if you're just as emo as everybody else in the scene, or if you're less emo. And if you're not as emo, then how can you be more emo? Or there's always a relationship to how they are in relationship to everybody else. Like,
yeah, and the fact that there's a scene.
Right.
I mean, that's social, even though you don't look at emo and say, oh, that's a social subtype.
Right.
But it is, because it's a group of like-minded people coming together and saying, we're going to go against the norms and show everybody how emo we are.
Right. Yeah. So again, just the relationship to the group. And so, and Erin, we've already mentioned how one can be negatively identified with their instinct. And so when that happens with social, they'll be antisocial, meaning they will just really not like to go out. They don't want to be around people. And this can happen for a few different reasons. But when there's not like phobia involved or some sort of trauma or, you know, anxiety disorder or something of that nature, then you're dealing with probably a negative identification with the social instinct. Now, the extent to which that is prevalent in someone's life and it gets a lot of attention is the extent to which someone is social. So in other words, somebody can be negatively identified with their social instinct and it not be first. So, for example, I wouldn't say I'm negatively or positively identified, it's more neutral for me. But I don't love groups, and I don't like doing group work and team building and all of that stuff. It's just not my cup of tea. But I'm also a 4. Now, with that said, if I need to do it, I can do it, and it's fine and whatever. But I'm social, probably social second. But if I were social subtype and negatively identified with that, then it would be constantly on my mind. I'd be constantly thinking about how I don't fit in, how much I really don't want to be around people, and every opportunity where I had to be around people would just be really avoided if I were negatively identified, particularly as a 4, as a withdrawn type. I would constantly be kind of defining myself outside of what the group was doing publicly, because it's an image. So I would, on Facebook would be going on and talking about constantly how different I was than everybody else and all of that. And I can do a little of that, but when I'm doing it, it's kind of fun. It's more my 7, and I'm just trying to be kind of a little subversive. But the focus if it's more focused and constant and all the time, then you're dealing with probably a negative social instinct. So if they're talking about it a lot, they're probably social. When it comes up, if the person's like, I don't really like that, I don't really like group work, I don't want to do team building, and if it comes up and they don't like it, well, it may not be their primary instinct, it's just something they don't like. So that's how you can kind of identify if it's primary or not. But particularly with the withdrawn types, with 4s, 5s, and 9s, and sometimes 6s, they won't recognize themselves as social because they'll say, well, I don't like groups, I don't like people. But you have to pay attention to how much of your energy is going into focusing on what the group is doing. Like, if you don't get invited to a party, even if you don't want to go, and it really bothers you and irks you for a long time and it really wounds you, you're probably social subtype. everybody would be a little wounded and a little upset, but the social subtype is really going to have a problem with that. Okay. Some social subtype exemplars. So I did one of each type here. Hillary Clinton is a great example of a social one. It's all about, shoulds, and we should do this for the people, and we should do that. And very stern social ones can have, really kind of amp up the judgmental nature that you get from one sometimes, but they're kind of trailblazing, and it's definitely more of the kind of rigid example of the one, the sort of stereotypical example of one that we think of. Eva Peron is a great example of a social two. If you are familiar with the musical Evita or anything about Eva Peron, she was your ultimate kind of social martyr, but the social two is all about figuring out how they can be of service to the group, but they also need to, their power comes from connecting people and knowing the people that have the power in the group. So the social two is kind of like the person behind the throne, the advisor behind the throne. And so she ended up getting more power than her husband, Juan Perón, because she was so, she had a really great savvy with people. She was charming, fashionable, but she also, it was really important for her to know the people on the inside, and that's how she influenced power. Ryan Seacrest is sort of your prototypical social three. I think we mentioned that in the past. He's, the celebrities, and he knows all of them, and he's kind of involved in everything. I mean, if you ever watch TV at the end of the credits, it seems like everything is a Ryan Seacrest production. Mm-hmm. He's sort of taking the reins from Dick Clark, who was he's the predecessor of Dick Clark, or Dick Clark is the predecessor of, anyway, I got this confused. Anyway, the point is that Ryan Seacrest is a great example of the social three, who's sort of coming in and showing that he knows the people who are cool, who are in power, and he's friendly, and he's just always on. I mean, it seems like Ryan Seacrest is always on. It's just amazing. Kurt Cobain is a great example of the negatively identified social four. I read a biography of him, and it was, the whole grunge culture developed in part because Kurt Cobain decided he wanted to start sort of a counter to the 90s, late 80s hair bands that were everywhere. And he was like, I'm not going to put on makeup and do my hair really big. I'm not going to wash my clothes at all. And I'm going to wear 9 different layers and sing kind of sad music. And so Kurt Cobain is a great example of this sort of countercultural aspect you can get with the social subtype, particularly with 4s and 6s and 5s. There's sort of a counterculture to what's going on. But he was very, very aware of how people perceived him. He acted like he wasn't, but when you read about him and people that knew him, he was very aware of how he was being perceived in relation to the group. Bill Gates, social 5, who decided he wanted to just completely change the face of computers, and in recent years has become more philanthropic, but it was about giving people the technology that they needed in order to do things that they didn't know that they could do. So Jennifer Aniston, this is a social 6. She's a great example of the sort of girl next door social 6. She could be self-pres, but I'm starting to think she's probably more social, but it's that sort of girl next door, everybody thinks she's really sweet and friendly, and she seems to get along with most people, but she's got kind of a tentativeness about her. And she was in the show Friends, which was just in general a social 6 show. I mean, the whole show was very social 6y. Now, they weren't all 6s, but most of them were. Perez Hilton, social 7, who exemplifies the sort of social 7 aspect of, the gossip, and he used to make a lot of quips and sometimes say some kind of nasty things about people, but the social 7 can get away with saying things about people that other people can't get away with. Joan Rivers is another great example of that. The high side of social 7 is they can be very utopian and want to bring people together, and but so he's a good example. Social 8, Martin Luther King Jr., I think that's pretty obvious. He sort of exemplifies that. Social 8 is the protector of all, friend to no one. So they kind of are hard to get to know personally because they feel like they need to keep distance in order to protect other people. And then Barack Obama, the ultimate kind of social 9, who's trying to bring people together.